last people in the waiting room join. So yeah, I think that's it. Okay, I think we can start. Very well, welcome to this webinar. My name is Charlotte Ruhbaum. I work for Stiftung Mercator, a German foundation where I'm project manager in the climate change program. Stiftung Mercator is a member of the EFG steering group, and in the name of the steering group, I welcome you to this webinar jointly organized by EFG and IUCN. EFG is the European Environmental Funder Group. It's a thematic network within the European Foundation Center, and it brings together funders active or interested in the field of environment, sustainable development, and also climate change. And the idea is to provide a safe space for funders to reflect on strategies, exchange experiences, find synergies, and that's what we also want to do with you here today. This webinar today is a part of a series of webinars we are offering over the summer, in addition to our biannual meetings in spring and autumn, which takes place this year also online. So why have we chosen today's topic under the headline question, can healthy ecosystems prevent future pandemics? First of all, of course, because it's of immediate interest. With COVID-19 putting the world in a state of emergency is, of course, a very topical issue, but it also, I think, is very interesting because it lies at the interface of different topics the foundations in our network are working on, such as biodiversity loss, agriculture, unsustainable land management, also climate change. So it's an issue which requires also looking beyond environmental communities and at the intersection with human health. I think this is a challenge, but it also displays the need for new collaborations also in the foundation sector. And finally, at least this is my impression, the topic is complicated. It raises many questions and therefore also leaves uncertainties on how to communicate on the issue. And we hope to bring some clarity with today's webinar on the knowledge available, on the possible solution, and also on the role foundations can play. To start, we would like to ask you to answer a short question, which should now appear on your screen. So, do you feel well informed about the link between environmental degradation and virus outbreaks, from 1, not at all, to 6, very well? So please answer this question. We have 20 seconds for that. Okay, another 10 seconds. Okay, thank you. I think we can now close the poll or show the results, Deborah. Great, thank you. So I think we have a relatively well-informed audience, let's say. So I'm looking forward to the discussion with you. A mixture of a little bit of everything, but with a clear tendency in the middle. So I hope we can enrich your knowledge, provide some food for thought for your work, but maybe later also in our moderator discussion also jointly brainstorm what we can do to improve the general level of knowledge on this issue in the general public, amongst politicians, but also across sectors. When we will finish the webinar, in the end, we will ask you to post some keywords which you take away from today's presentation and discussion. This will not only help me with my job to present a summary in the end, but also gives us all an impression which aspects from the discussion are important for you as the audience. So we will, in a second, we will post a link in the chat to an online tool where you can also during the presentations enter important keywords. Please feel free to already fill in the word cloud during the webinar, and I will then present the results in the end. So use that. It gives you the possibility to contribute to the summary. Some final words on technicalities. Speakers will not answer questions or comments between the presentations, but you can already post your questions in the chat at any time. We will then take them up in the Q&A session. And please also do not hesitate to use the chat to share initiatives with the group where you work on the topics today, which you want to let others know. And once we open the Q&A session, you can also raise your hand, and with your raise your hand symbol next to your name, and the moderator will then invite you to unmute yourself and pose your questions. So you can also pose your questions directly, or you can post them in the chat. Yeah. So before I now hand over to Tina Lain from IUCN, who is our moderator today, I want to thank already the IUCN colleagues for the good cooperation and the preparation of this webinar. And of course, also our two external speakers, which Tina will present in a minute. Tina works for IUCN Netherlands, which is the Dutch National Committee of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And she has been coordinating since 2010 the IUCN Congo programs, as well as the regional programs in the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region, addressing wildlife crime and illegal wildlife trade. So Tina, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Charlotte. Welcome, everybody. Very happy to be moderating this group. It's probably the group with the most doctors and professors that I ever had to moderate. So like Charlotte say, what we are going to try to do during this session is to try to find ways to break with the silos of the different topics. So we are really at an intersection between health and conservation. And we think it's very important to come with a balanced and collaborative approach between these kind of different disciplines and scientists. And for this topic, we have three knowledgeable speakers. I'm going to start with Dr. Catarina Ferreira, who is from the European Biodiversity Conservation, and she's coordinator, and also from the IUCN European Regional Office, where she works to tackle environmental crises in the region. So during this session, Catarina is going to help us setting the scene about the pandemics, about biodiversity and health, and also how all have been evolving during the past years. The second speaker that we have is Dr. Kris Walzer. Kris Walzer is Director of the Global Health Wildlife Conservation Society. He's based in New York, so it's morning for him. He is going to be working on the linking between wildlife health and conservation. So it's much more looking at the interface between the two topics. Kris is going to dive into the emerging of diseases, and he's also going to let us see how nothing of what he's telling us is new, but certainly the impact is increasing greatly. Our last speaker is much more into the planetary and health specialist. He's Associate Professor Chris Murray. He's lecturer on ecological health at the Grantham Institute of School of Public Health in London. And he's a disease ecologist focusing on disease emergence and also sustainability and climate. Chris is going to help us find the opportunities for synergies between public health and nature conservation. And at the beginning, I saw that we could divide them the three, like the conservationist, the interface, and the health expert. But at the end, when you look at the background and at their scope of intervention, you see that actually there is no possibility to dissect that. Each one of them has been tackling health issues as conservation issues. And I think this really highlights the interconnectedness of the topics of the world in which we live and also of people and nature. So given that, I'm going to give the word to Catarina, who is going to start setting up the scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that kind introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully I'll succeed. So bear with me a moment, please. I think I did it. Can you see my screen?
Looks very good.
Okay, I'll just, sorry about that. I'll enter my video because sometimes my connection isn't great. You can see my screen still, right? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Okay. So thank you, Tina, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure. Before I dive into the topic, I would just like to provide a very brief overview of what IUCN is. for those of you who are less familiarized with the organization. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature is one of the world's oldest and largest conservation organizations. It's a membership union that is uniquely comprised of both government and civil society organizations. It's roughly 70 years old, and it harnesses the experience, resources, and reach of its now close to 1,400 member organizations. And the input of approximately 15,000 voluntary experts that are dedicated to different topics and aggregated in 6 commissions and work together to tackle various conservation issues. IUCN is the global authority on the status of the natural world and the measures that are needed to be implemented to safeguard it. Like organizations, we have a vision and a mission. The vision is to have a just world that values and conserves nature. And the unique composition of the membership and the governance structure, plus the knowledge and the tools that we help develop and mobilize, allows IUCN to give a voice to biodiversity and amplify it, to increase policy impact, and help governments fulfill their international commitments, environmental commitments, like the SDGs and Aichi targets. And by doing so, the organization helps provide direct benefits to people and nature alike. So the topic of this webinar is all about how healthy ecosystems can help us prevent future pandemics in light of recent events. And the starting point for this conversation is really to understand that the relationship between humans and nature, and consequently between biodiversity and human health, has been an evolving one. The natural world, that includes soils and soil biodiversity, contains naturally occurring pathogens that are in a state of equilibrium with the ecosystems and the organisms in which they inhabit. It wasn't until humans were brought into the picture that they became obviously the planet's dominant organism and have been disrupting this balance ever since. So critically, the shift in the relationship has started a little after the end of the last glaciation, which is around 10,000 years ago, when we went from being hunters and gatherers to embracing a more sort of settled lifestyle that was fueled by cultivated plants and domesticated animals. And this led to the rapid growth of our ability to expand, to extract, produce, and destroy with the emergence of the first sort of complex civilizations. During this period of time, all this exploitation has reduced substantially, nearly halved the global terrestrial plant biomass. And so we've evolved to dominate the biosphere. And together with livestock, we currently account for over 90% of all mammal biomass on Earth, with wild animals representing a mere 1%. So this results in us depending largely on the products of nature for food, animal feed, raw materials, and energy, which has also caused massive impacts on the biosphere. So this puts not just this sort of relationship, puts not only enormous strains on biodiversity, but also increases the likelihood to exposure to pathogens, because the health of humans and ecosystems and animals are all interconnected. But it also has disrupted people. So the last centuries have seen a marked increase on the number of people that are living in cities and urban areas, and this is quite a unique trend to the past centuries, this urbanization. Today, more people live in urban areas than in rural ones, and this trend is projected to continue to the extent that by 2050, there's nearly 7 million people that are projected to live in urban areas. This has many consequences. This has many consequences. Two of the biggest ones being that sort of instills an increased mobility of wildlife and wildlife products that are mostly driven by commercial trade from rural areas to cities. But also, just importantly, it promotes a certain disconnect between humans and the natural world, which has also very serious implications for our health and well-being. So why do we care that we don't live in a functional relationship with nature? Why is this balance or unbalance so important? Well, first and foremost, because there are very valuable ecosystem services that are provided for free by nature, and they are critical to our survival. So the picture on the left in the slide gives an overview of all the ecosystem services that are provided by soils alone, and they are critical to maintain our well-being, our health, and our survival on the planet. So we really can't afford to lose these ecosystem services that are so essential for things like clean air, drinkable water, climate mitigation, that also means that we can't, and that are provided by wild species and habitats, and that means that we can't also afford to lose the 1%, that 1%, and ever shrinking 1% of wild animals and plants that provide those services. And while some of these species might be spillover for diseases, they actually provide valuable ecosystem services, so we can't afford to lose them. This is, for example, the case of bats, and which played a major role in this recent pandemic, and pollination services. On the other hand, it's becoming more and more established that both human economies and societies are part of the biosphere. They're not separate elements. And a few years ago, the Stockholm Resilience Center sort of put forward a model that presents the Sustainable Development Goals, which are sort of international goals agreed by all countries to promote prosperity while protecting the planet. And the way that they've presented in this sort of wedding cake model is actually quite good to show the connection between these different parts. And so, and it points to, and to point to the need for a transition towards a logic of the world that where economy serves the society, but within sort of planetary boundaries. So the pandemics are really just indicators of a wider and bigger issue, which is fundamentally rooted in biodiversity loss, climate change, and ecosystem degradation, and the way that we as humans deal with nature. And these are all signals that are becoming more and more mainstreamed and recognized as risks, even by sort of previously less environmentally aware sectors like the financial and the business sector. Because they are becoming more apparent and more alarming. Climate is striking harder and more rapidly than ever before. You have more natural disasters and extreme events like flooding, but also heat waves. Global temperatures are rising. And then the latest global assessment done by the IPBES also found that up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction, which is a number that was never seen in human history. So these are very clear red flags that we are pushing our planet to the limit, and this has consequences as well for our health and our health systems around the world that have now to deal with the rise of new vulnerabilities that results from these shifts in patterns of demography and environmental issues and societal patterns as well. The drivers the causes for the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem degradation are fairly clear to us at this stage. The way that they may impact biodiversity, the natural world, and the way that they are connected among each other might not always be so straightforward and clear and well understood, and so that bit needs more research. But the main drivers are well known, and it really comes down to human activities. The indirect drivers, so those that are essentially pushing for the declines, are related to demography, so the growth of human population, geopolitics, technical advances, governance, and obviously conflicts and epidemics. And these all translate in turn into pressures to all sorts of environments on Earth, from terrestrial to freshwater and marine. The main pressures, what they are, is also quite consensual among the scientific community. It's the changes in the use and the way that we use land and seascapes the exploitation of direct exploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, invasion, invasive alien species. These are the top 5, but there are others. And on your right, you have a list of examples of declines in nature that I won't go into, because at this stage I've given you already enough depressing statistics, so I think you get the picture. But they are there in case you want to learn more. Bringing this a bit closer to home, the graph in the slide below shows the red list index over time, calculated for birds, mammals, and amphibians in Europe and Central Asia. This figure was extracted from the regional assessment of the status of biodiversity and ecosystem services in this region. The red list index is a metric developed by IUCN, and what essentially does is measure the change in the overall extinction risk of species. And it varies between 0 and 1, and let's just say that the closer to 0, the worse. So the closer the species are to extinction, whereas the closest to 1, the better. So as you can already guess from the direction of the lines in the graph, for the European and Central Asian regions, species extinction rate is increasing. And this is a trend that mimics the global trend. Europe is no exception, unfortunately. And while we are not considered to be a megadiverse continent, there are biodiversity hotspots like the Mediterranean basin, and Europe is home to many endemic species that occur nowhere else in the world. So we have... Thank you. We have a responsibility to safeguard the integrity of this biodiversity and effectively tackle the threats to it. And the main threats in Europe are agricultural, by far is the main threat to species and habitats. But there are others like invasive alien species, habitat loss and fragmentation, pollution and overexploitation that present challenges for us to overcome in the next decade. Just very briefly on the tools, we know the causes of biodiversity because we're sort of monitoring the status of biodiversity and habitats in Europe. And we are doing this using at IUCN the European red lists, which essentially measure the likelihood of a species becoming extinct in the near future. I won't go into details, I'm happy to discuss this, but it's essentially to showcase some of the groups that have been covered already. There's close to 20 European red lists that have been published, and they are useful to inform decision and policy-making processes in the region, as well as trigger policy responses. And these are my last 2 slides now. I don't want to end on a negative note, so let's take this to a good note, and also because I'm an optimistic. So I'll end with just a couple of very brief examples of initiatives that are trying to push back these declining trends and restore the relationship between humans and nature. One of them is the Bond Challenge, which, just like the slide says, it's a global effort to plant 100 million hectares of trees to restore degraded and deforested land by 2020, and there's another target of 15 million by 2030. To date, there are 63 governments, private associations, and companies that have pledged to attain and surpass the 2020 target, so that's good news. However, this initiative is working very well outside Europe, but not so well in Europe, so this is a bit of a gap that could be filled in by the European philanthropic community. These large-scale restoration efforts require investment in enabling conditions and implementation, so it's important to understand what are the financial and human, social conditions in place in certain regions to design the measures that need to be implemented. And finally, restoring the balance is not just about planting more trees. It obviously, and it's not just a matter of enclosing biodiversity in protected areas. We must restore also the function and the resilience of ecosystems, because it's when these are not working well, when they are dysfunctional, that things happen, like viruses starting to jump from wildlife to livestock and humans. So it's quite important to maintain this natural connectivity. The current European political landscape through the European Green Deal offers good opportunities to upscale restoration action across Europe and improve connectivity between species and natural ecosystems. And IUCN has just launched a series of guidelines to help and support stakeholders to better connect ecosystems and enhance this ecological connectivity. And it also has a series of case studies that showcase the current approaches to doing so. So I will end here. I think the main message is that we can restore the relationship. So that's where I would like to end. We can restore the relationship. It's not an easy task. It's not a trivial task, and we need to be smart in the way that we rebuilt it. To keep our planet healthy depends on it. And we, especially in light of the recent pandemics, we can't just go back to normal as if nothing happened. We need to restore these links to nature and biodiversity, and ensure we follow a more sustainable path into the future. And to learn more about the work that we do, I invite you to follow the links in the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catarina. Thank you very much. I will give the word to Kris, and Kris, it's your floor.
So good morning, everyone from the Bronx. Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. You may be surprised that a conservation organization talks about health in any way. I just wanted to point out that the WCS, working across the globe in some 60 countries, has a more than 100 years of wildlife health program, which is quite extraordinary. It's one of the first actually in the world. It's also one of the One Health founders back in 2004, which was recently updated in the Berlin Principles in 2019, just a mere month and a half before the outbreak of this ongoing pandemic. And the great thing about WCS, honestly, is that we're multidisciplinary at the core. So we have health teams, but of course we're driven by conservationists, counter wildlife trafficking programs, and really extensive program working with indigenous peoples and local communities and so on. I'm going to talk to you about zoonosis and about outbreaks generally, and Catarina has set the scene excellently, showing us we're in the midst of the Anthropocene, and the impacts of these diseases are obviously increasing. I just sort of want to touch on about 3/4 of all zoonotic emerging infectious diseases originating in wildlife, and this is nothing particularly new. We acquired many of these diseases when we domesticated livestock. One of probably the the most well-known disease that we've acquired from cattle is measles. We've made it a uniquely human disease in the meantime. But what's really important is to understand that these diseases are increasing. And if you look at it, Ebola virus disease is a very good example. Just in the DRC, there have been 11 outbreaks of Ebola since 1976. 9 of those happened in the past 13 years and 5 since 2018. And that's just talking about Ebola. And, poor DRC is being hit by multiple other ongoing pandemics and endemic diseases. So what do we know about this coronavirus 2? Well, it's a zoonotic origin pandemic. There's broad consensus for that. The ancestral host is in a horseshoe bat species. What's not clear, unfortunately, is that the time, place, the mechanism of the spillover event, that's quite unclear. There's a very strong signal from a wildlife trading market in Wuhan, China. Of the 450 some first cases, more than 50% were linked directly to that market. But unfortunately, there's information lacking. But I do want to point out the WHO has sent a team to Wuhan. They're on their way there. And one of the central questions is to resolve this question about the environmental samples that were taken there. Some 500 environmental samples were taken at the market. 33 were positive, and 31 of those were from the western part of the market where the wildlife was housed and the wildlife traders were. So this is quite a strong signal, but we really are lacking information at this point in time. The other thing that's really changed for those of you who were already working in this field in 2002, 2003 with SARS, which was a much more deadly version of this virus, what's really changed is our interconnectedness in the world. Just as a figure, before the pandemic and travel bans, some 750 people were traveling daily from Wuhan, China to New York City, for example. So that's an extraordinary amount of people. Nothing new. I think you know this. We already knew about this. We just didn't act on it. There was a clear indication it was coming. The highlight is the 2019 exercise in the United States. on how to deal with this. The exercise determined they're completely incapable of dealing with it, had absolutely no consequences, and a few months later, it's a real exercise. But what I really want to point out today, it's really not about bat soup, civets, or pangolins. It's all about this. It's all about interfaces. So you can see a road here going, a logging road maybe going through a forest. You could look at it and say it goes from A to B. But actually, what's really important is a huge interface. These are the new interfaces. In the forest here, you have naturally circulating viruses, many of them, absolutely naturally. They circulate there. Sometimes they cause disease. More often than not, they don't. By providing a road there, you suddenly provide interactions with humans. And so along these edges of destruction of the forest, the first 300-400 meters in the forest where most of the exchange is happening. So you get the possibility for a virus to jump over to switch over to humans and or their wildlife, their livestock. And then of course with transportation and virus evolution, the virus can acquire the necessary traits to move out of that area and then transmit from human to human, which is the situation that we have now with COVID-19. I just want to, there'll be some links at the end of this presentation. We've pulled together quite comprehensive literature, what is really known and what is not as well known about environment and spillover events. And I also just want to make the point, it's difficult for viruses to spill over. A lot of things have to align for that to happen. We're the ones who are facilitating these alignments, of course, uniquely. So one of the things about how do we address this? We've seen some approaches where it's being addressed, trying to address this on a species level or on a viral level. Let's look at coronaviruses in bats and some other so-called high-risk, completely undefined species. Just want to make it clear that about 1.7 million unknown viruses across mammals and birds, and about 700,000 of those are potentially zoonotic. So even if they got it wrong by an order of magnitude, we're talking about a lot of viruses. This is not a way we're going to be able to tackle this. That's really, really important to understand, I think. So the mechanisms, how this happens, and I think this is really important to understand. I'm not going to waste much time. It's called recombination. So what basically happens, and this is a coronavirus particularly good at that, they are able to infect two viruses, infect a cell at the same time, a living cell, and then they will exchange genetic information and you will get new properties in a novel virus coming on. So one of the ways this happens really well is if you trade in live animals. So large commercial markets where you bring live animals from wildlife, let's say 100 species together, and you stack them on top of each other to put, you know, the poor old pangolin here again, but the pangolin is on top of a civet, then you put in some domestic animals and they're pooping on top of each other. So you add some squirrels, some chickens and so on. And this is just a perfect laboratory to create new viruses. So this is quite different than any other interface we know. And that's why this strong focus from WCS on the market. I want to point out also markets is only part of the issue. Of course, you have the whole value chain, which you need to deal with as this product moves along. And we've seen in our studies in Vietnam, looking at field rats, that as the animal moves along the field value chain, food value chain, positivity to coronavirus in this case increases. So my recommendation, if you're going to eat a rat, eat it and process it on the field. Don't wait and process it in the restaurant, because by the time it gets there, every second one is going to be positive for coronavirus. Let me also be clear, one thing that's really important, while we're talking about large commercial markets in Southeast Asia, which sell the products to the new wealthy middle class, these are status symbols, these are luxury items. This does not hold true for example, Congo Basin, parts of the Amazon, where these are an absolute necessity for indigenous peoples and local communities to meet their nutritional demand. It's not only protein, it's also micronutrients and so on. So we need to work with them to facilitate and make sure these needs and rights are met. And I'll just direct you to some of the key policy documents we have out there. It's a complex issue. There's no way I can get through all of this in 10 minutes, so please bear with me. The other thing that's important is we need to keep working on surveillance. Surveillance is going to help us potentially detect the next spillover, and that works really well by involving indigenous communities at these spillover front lines and engaging and using modern technology. We have some great technology. It's not a technological fix, but we can use this to address spillover events as they're happening, as we're doing here in Northern Republic of Congo we have an Ebola network in place. So what do we want to do? WCS is saying, at this time, the most expedient and most useful thing we can do is to ban the commercial trade of wildlife for consumption. This is commercial live animal trade in priority, the large urban centers, of course. We need to, at the same time, ensure the rights and needs of the indigenous peoples and communities who have a completely different system in dealing with this. But we also need to combat the trafficking of these wild animals, of course. It goes hand in hand. We need to change the consumption behaviors, so behavioral change, working in social marketing and similar things. I invite you to visit our detailed policy statements on that. And finally, just there's a lot of information on our websites, a lot of policy documents addressing both overseas development, indigenous peoples and coronavirus and background as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm really happy to talk more about this. It's a bit of a whirlwind. So thanks for bearing with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kris, for giving us so much information in such a short time. We are going to start a discussion with Kris Murray. Kris Murray, I mean, our two previous speakers have been talking around the relationship between health and conservation. And we have seen that, I mean, it's not always easy to connect. Even so, some organizations like WCS have been working for more than 100 years around this connection and the importance of this connection. So how do you think we can have environmental and health experts, professionals work together and find better ways to look at joint solutions? And what do you think is missing? Why are we not able really to look at this as a team effort together?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, sorry, I've got quite a significant echo here. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks also for the invite to join this really interesting and obviously very topical discussion today. And thanks to both of the speakers for providing what I think was just an absolutely excellent and very well balanced sort of summary of kind of where we're at in terms of how we're imagining the forces of the Anthropocene coming together and creating this, you know, what has turned out to be a fairly catastrophic problem. And of course, now we need to think about how to get out of it and how to sort of think about it not occurring again. So just to sort of give a little bit of a history to the people on the call that may be sort of less familiar with the general idea of collaboration between human health sort of sciences and wildlife health sciences, because I think the two pictures here that we've got the human disease side of things, which is where we're picking up these infections, where we're mostly, you know, for better or worse, concerned about managing those risks in people, but also this huge amount of work that's going on in wildlife and in animal hosts, you know, from vets and ecologists and environmental scientists. And so I guess a little bit of the history around that is that it used to be the case that health and, you know, human health and animal health was maybe slightly more integrated. And through time, through the increasing specialization of the medical sciences, those two worlds seem to have diverged quite considerably. And we got to a point, probably, you know, I'm guessing sort of 10, 15 years ago, where those two sciences were, you know, fairly far apart. And more recently, I guess over the sort of course of the last 15, 20 years, there's been this strong effort to try to reconnect this kind of human health world and the wildlife health world. And as Kris mentioned before, WCS was a sort of a spearhead and the seed of this kind of concept of One Health, where we're very much thinking about the interconnections between the environment, animal health, and human health. And so this model's been very influential. It's been picked up by a number of governments around the world, and trying, you know, through the advocacy of practitioners in this at this interface, bringing this kind of integrated multidisciplinary perspective to issues of human health. That's had, you know, its huge challenges. It's had its successes, but it's had its huge challenges. And there are a number of other, you know, sort of models of this interdisciplinary approach. And maybe some of you on the call have heard terms like eco-health, One Health, planetary health. These are disciplines that are characterized by this explicit aim to be more multidisciplinary, more collaborative between the human health and medical sciences. So those efforts are there. They even go back to some of the big global agreements that we've had coming out of, for example, the Millennium Development Goals and and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at these frameworks, there is this explicit recognition of the interconnectedness between nature and human health. So I guess the challenge is now to identify, well, you know, what went wrong. Kris mentioned that, you know, in the assessment of pandemic risk for the US, that the metrics were all over the place, and it turned out very badly. That basically where we thought some of the countries, you know, Western countries with huge budgets were well prepared, it turned out that we were, you know, more or less sideswiped by the complexity of issues around pandemic emergence. One area of that which I think is particularly poorly assessed is this spillover that Kris has been talking about, the interface between wildlife and people, and how do we think about, you know, doing better at that, you know, in that particular place, at that interface. What do we need to do more? I've got my own perspectives on that. My background's in ecology, but I've moved more recently into a faculty of medicine, so I'm kind of used to dealing with people that have no idea what I'm talking about a lot of the time because of that very different background. There is a huge difference in mindset between medically trained people and people trained in environmental sciences, and we're trying our best to overcome those differences and those gaps and meet in the middle and there's a bunch of global efforts around that. So I guess to open up the panel discussion, I would throw it back to, you know, perhaps Kris in the first instance to maybe give us his perspective about how WCS as one of the biggest global conservation agencies on the planet have, you know, proactively tried to engage with, you know, human health and the medical sciences to get to the point where we are today. Perhaps Kris, you can give us a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kris. That's you know, that's a really central question, and it's really difficult. So just I think this COVID-19 has shown us how hard it is to operationalize and One Health approaches or planetary health approaches. It's similar, and also makes maybe reassess where the actual drivers are. That's the other thing. So I talk about the front lines of spillover, and I do that because that sort of gets a picture across. But you know, we also have to think more broadly and say other drivers of the front lines of spillover in New York, Hong Kong, Frankfurt, and London, because this is actually what's happening. So there is encroachment of the environment. That's not happening because some indigenous people are going hunting. It's happening for other reasons. So that's something we definitely have to revisit. I'm sure this will, it's too far here. So one of the ways we engage is that we set up a frontline monitoring network in Northern Republic of Congo, for example, integrating, you know, SMS messaging and molecular diagnostics, and make sure that that feeds into the National Republic of Congo Public Health Service, so that if we detect Ebola virus at some time, that information feeds in. That sounds like super easy. I think they spent 25 years to try to get these things to mesh. So this is something we really need to work on. How do we get the information is there and the possibilities are there, but how do we get them to work together and streamline the response? Because it's no good having the information, absolutely no one's going to react. So it's not a good answer. We also, of course, work a lot on these front lines on markets and so on. And in Southeast Asia, where we've been the longest, probably now 2 decades of doing this, the ties with the public health authorities and researchers and labs and so on is very, very tight. And I think we're seeing that, but it's taken decades. That's what we really have to say that.
Thank you. I mean, one question maybe to you all. in terms of collaboration, I've been working quite a long time around illegal wildlife trade, and I think one of the biggest obstacles that we have when we talk about collaboration and working better together to be able, you know, to detect networks and so on. The thing is that people don't exchange information because they don't always trust each other, and they're not really open to share information with others. Do you think there is also this kind of feeling between conservationists and health professionals that they don't really trust their approaches? Is there any kind of obstacle there?
Could I jump into that? It's just just a quick one. So this is a really interesting subject. You know, there's been publications about how bad they cooperate and don't cooperate. So, but in my personal experience, this has never been an issue. I think it's very personal, and you need to build up these trustful relationships. On the counter wildlife trafficking thing, I just want to say how our own organization works. They won't even tell us what they're doing. Just so you know, I get on well with Scott Robertson and my colleagues, but he's not going to be telling me what he's doing because he's always worried about leaks. So I think the counter wildlife trafficking is quite special. Sorry for jumping in there.
Very good. So there is no problem of trust between the experts. It's just being able to connect in a certain point.
Sorry, can I just jump in and maybe add to Kris's answer there that whereas the willingness is often there, one of the big barriers that I kind of come across, as I sort of alluded to, is the fact that we're speaking such very different languages a lot of the time. You know, on the human health end, there's a very well formulated vocabulary around epidemiology and public health investigation and the types of scientific methodology that people are using in the medical sciences is related but quite different and differently framed and differently taught than it is in ecology, environmental science, even vet science. I suspect is quite divergent from human medical science. So I think there's been a few efforts to try to overcome this, what is essentially a linguistics or a sort of a, it's quite pragmatic kind of communication barrier, because we're speaking slightly different languages a lot of the time. And where you would think that the language sort of translation across cultures, between different actual languages would be a bigger challenge. Actually, I think the jumping the barriers of the scientific language is often the bigger issue.
Okay. So maybe Catarina, can I ask you something about, during your presentation, you say that why it was important to care about what was happening. And I think now Kris is also mentioning that there is a problem of language, and it is also important to restore this relationship. So what would be your advice? So how can we make people care more about what's happening, about planetary health? How do we make politicians care more, the general public care more about this subject, and which kind of language do we have to use to be able to touch them?
Thank you, Tina, for that. Very interesting and difficult question. I'll jump into actually what both Krises have just said, which I think is really like it's the nail, or a hammer in the nail, however you say it. And I think it's really critical because it starts a bit there in the sort of the scientific community, the difference in mindsets and languages. And also the fact that these challenges are sort of perpetuated by the fact that when you look at funding agencies and even publishers, journals, even though interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is something that is becoming more and more accepted as critical for us to make any progress in addressing all of these crises, the systems are simply still not there to actually reward, for example, scientists to do more transdisciplinary research and to have all these different disciplines come together and create a sort of a unifying framework to work in language. So I think that it starts a bit there. So if there's an urge, sort of a direction to push at this more expert level, would be to really encourage funding agencies to bring, to to really reward these more of interdisciplinary studies, or the merging of these communities. And this can start even here in this network. If this is a topic that is transversal to different sort of disciplines, maybe you can bring different networks together to sort of discuss them collectively. So that is one aspect of where, more in the sort of science knowledge generation side of things. And then when we move into policy responses and the stakeholders, wider sort of stakeholder base, I think what we need to create is sort of more platforms that allow for this exchange between science and policy and stakeholder dialogue, and in particular within these two worlds, so that merge these health and nature conservation actors and are able to then extract communication actions to make sure that this knowledge finds its way into policy development and actions on the ground, and can generate public awareness on the topics that we're discussing here today. There's very good examples already occurring, for example, in Europe. The Large Carnivores Initiative has that aim. It's an initiative that was set up a few years ago with the support of the European Commission to bring together the relevant and stakeholders that are somewhat affected by impacts of large carnivores recovering all over the continent, and minimize and manage better these conflicts between large carnivores and farmers, hunters, but even the tourist operators, because there's quite a few dramatic cases in Finland, for example, of bears attacking tourists. So this sort of different stakeholders are brought together into roundtables and coexistent platforms is what they call it. So the European Commission has been funding these sort of platforms to bring together the stakeholders to agree on a unifying language, debate the issues, and co-design solutions. And I think that's a critical element. The co-design of solutions that serve everyone's interests, or to the extent possible, and translate into practical action on the ground. So that would be my take on it.
Oops. And do you think that the general public has a say within the planetary health? Do you think we are hearing them enough? Do you think they do understand what is at stake, or do we have to find also new ways to engage with them?
I think this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kris.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think that's a really, really, really good question, and I think you don't have to look too far. For example, the youth climate health movement is a fantastic example of where people are very much engaged with these concepts in planetary health, and are getting increasingly vocal about it. I would probably say that is not people aren't out on the street at this point campaigning about the wildlife trade for pandemic risk reasons. But if you sort of take a step back and sort of think about some of these environmental trajectories as sort of like the syndrome, or like some kind of health syndrome that the planet is in, I think a really curious, it's almost like it has been referred to as a paradox, is that the metrics around environmental health have basically never been worse than they are now. The world is in pretty much the worst state, from a natural environment perspective than it's been in at least in our history. In contrast, for human health, the world's probably never been better. Life expectancy is maximized now relative to any point in the past. We've dropped the mortality rates for infectious diseases, for the most part across the planet. There's sort of few exceptions of areas where all-cause infectious disease is going up. And so there's this really sort of different messaging around, health successes and environmental successes. There is a little area of this, questioning what explains this paradox. And of course, those of you who are sort of engaged in this area will quickly sort of recognize that there could, for example, be, lags built in. So maybe our health is great now, but in 20, 30, 100 years time, when we've exhausted all of the natural resources on the planet, we could expect some, catastrophic health impact, and perhaps even, something like a pandemic is an example of that type of catastrophe occurring. So I think that there is, you know, clear recognition by people that want to hear it around these issues, and maybe a bigger challenge is that sometimes this comes up, you know, in direct conflict with some other metrics of life and quality of life and well-being that we actually hold very dear to us, including, for example, you know, our GDP, or, you know, whatever it is, you know, our salary at the end of the day, kind of thing. So we have personal and institutional kind of barriers to overcome to meet this paradox in the middle and resolve it and solve it.
Thank you, Kris. Maybe one last question for Kris, which is also related to what Kris Murray also just said. During your presentation, you were also mentioning the interface and how we see that there is more and more alignments that cause this kind of problems. And so how do you think we can start? What kind of actionable measures can we take to reduce these alignments?
So, how do we save the planet? Well, so one of the things, of course, I'm trying to get at, there are some types of interfaces which just have higher risk, and even if the mechanisms are not completely elucidated, I'm Austrian, so I'm a European. I've grown up with a precautionary principle in all my projects. That's the way I work. So for me, on a precautionary principle, banning live animal markets now, no discussion. We're not going to wait. I mean, I see people want to do more studies. It's just, you know, it's extraordinary. How many more studies are we going to do? We need to act now, and it really is the live animals. So that's one I would start at. These live commercial markets, they do not impact people who are dependent on this, and it's as I said, a luxury item. And then, of course, we need to strengthen public health services in the high biodiversity belt, and I think Kris Murray was on one of these seminal papers where they sort of pointed out the high biodiversity areas. But I always want to be cautious. This is it's a guessing game. It's just because there are a lot of viruses in the high biodiversity area and in bats and rodents, it doesn't mean that's where the next spillover is going to be. I always like the idea of Zika. You know, that sort of snuck up on us and everyone was looking somewhere else. MERS is also a good one. I don't think anyone can come up with the Middle East and camels, even in your wildest dreams. I don't think anyone comes up. And my favorite, what I always want to bring up is the German, 3 or 4 people being killed in Germany, dying in Germany of an infection they acquired from a exotic squirrel through a Borna-virus. That Borna-virus did not transmit from human to human, but honestly, no one would have come up with that idea. So it's a numbers game. We need to start working on the front where a lot of spillover is happening and there's a lot of potential, but we need to be attentive. This is not going to end pandemics, or at least not epidemics. We need to be really clear. We're just going to mitigate the number. So we need to stop we've got to flatten the curve on the outbreaks.
Okay. Thank you so much to our 3 speakers. I think it's time for us maybe to start the Q&A. But before, I mean, you can raise your hand and then we will take some of the questions. We also have, I think, questions that were probably collected during the presentations. But one question that I also have to you all, I think we have realized that what we need here is to break the silos. We need to be able to better find ourselves, work together, find a common language. And maybe one of the questions that I would like to give to all of you, the audience, is what can you do? I mean, where do you think we need to put more efforts, and what are possible actions that you think you could try to do? So I don't know, Charlotte, do we have already some questions of maybe some people wants to give us some of their impressions?
Yeah, we have a question from the chat from Daniel Moss, which is on agroecology. He's asking, or he's curious about the lessons which there are on sustainable forms of agriculture, which might protect and regenerate ecosystems, and that as such play a role in ecosystem stability, and how we can curb industrial agriculture and its destructive tendencies. So, don't know who wants to answer that question, but it's on the role of agriculture and how sustainable agriculture, agroecology can help.
I can take an initial stab at that. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an absolutely critical issue in the sense that agriculture has been the main driver of land use change globally. You know, half the habitable earth is currently agricultural land, and the other half is nature, roughly. And then there's another percentage of the earth which is considered uninhabitable. So it's the major local force when it comes to landscape characteristics and landscape, you know, the relationship that people have to landscapes on just a vast part of the planet. One thing to sort of pick up on from what Kris said is that it's a numbers game here, and I don't think that we're advocating, you know, that if you go into a particular spot and sort of work out what the you know, what viruses an animal species is carrying, that you can then put a clamp on that pathway to spillover. You know, it's about trying to reduce the overall risk of modified landscapes or landscapes that are being modified in terms of seeding something like this. But that's by far and away not the only issue, and maybe an issue that you know, that we need to think about more holistically is, you know, how do you get the most out of landscapes, not just for one individual scientific issue like spillover, but for a whole bunch of different ecosystem service values or ecosystem values, you know, so that you can stack them up in a way where you're maximizing the total ecosystem service value of a whole landscape. This is something that I've started to think about a lot more. I have got you know, my academic history is focusing on emerging infections, but the more I think about it, the more I'm working in you know, in the field, in places where there's these multiple sources of pressure, developmental pressure, you know, increasing human health and well-being, increasing resilience of landscapes, becoming resilient to climate change. All of this kind of stuff it's telling me very much that we need to be thinking about these multiple health outcomes and multiple environmental outcomes at the same time in the same landscapes. Without doing that, we can't work out what the optimal approach for any particular landscape is. So an example of that from biodiversity science, which has been relatively influential, is this model of, you know, do we spare land for biodiversity and increase our agricultural productivity into a smaller area, or do we share land where we have, you know, wildlife friendly farmlands, for example? What gives you a better bang for your buck in terms of the, you know, the dual outcomes of crop productivity or local livelihoods and biodiversity conservation? And the thing that I've kind of noticed, having delved into this, you know, over the last sort of couple of years, is that actually we have very, very little information about the health benefits or the health costs of different configurations in landscapes. This is something that we're trying to sort of resolve at the moment. So what that might mean, what that might mean in practice is, how about some projects that go out and look at the multiple values all at the same time, stack them up, and see if there's some type of optimal configuration of landscapes that hit these targets that we're hoping for. It's almost like a local scale level of the SDGs. The SDGs are nationally aggregated at the moment, and that's maybe not the most useful level when we're thinking about the co-benefits across landscapes for health and the environment.
Yeah, thank you. I think quite a lot of work has been doing around landscape, but so far, for me, it's the first time that I really hear that we also have to introduce this kind of health vision within a landscape, which I think is very interesting. And certainly a lot, I mean, IUCN has been working also a lot with a landscape approach. It's certainly something where we can work on it and certainly look at what are possible all the actions that we can take. Charlotte, do you have other questions that came out during the presentation, or should we put some of these questions here?
Yeah, we have, sorry, we have a few more questions from the chat. One is from Ferreira from the Global Green Grant Fund, and it's on communication. So I will read it out. She says, one of the interesting developments during this time was the nature is healing itself and humans are the problem virus messaging. So in brackets, you can read it. That sometimes veered dangerously close to ecofascism. Do any of the speakers encounter these kind of arguments in their field, and how do you push back against them? So quite a tricky question, I would say, but very interesting. But I will take up the next one as well, so you can maybe answer them together in a row. It's a question from Emma McIntosh from Mercator. She says the nuance around a call for a ban on the commercial trade in wildlife for consumption is important here. There are a range of approaches different NGOs have been calling for has been complicating the messaging. What do you think needs to happen to avoid confusing audiences? So it's also in communication. So maybe we can try to put that in one answering round.
I don't mind taking an initial. I'm fascinated by the ecofascism approach. That's something that's quite central to the way I work and how I think I feel quite aligned to both Catarina and Kris on this, because after working this for decades, you suddenly start to seeing a very much larger complex picture. And so as I was pointing out in my talk, the front lines of spillover may not be where you intuitively think they are, the dark heart of Africa or something like that, but maybe in a boardroom of a corporation in New York or multinational corporation and so on. So we do have this problem that we have humans on one side and nature on the other side, and we need to work on this relationship. You know, it depends where you're coming from, what your background is, and your ethical framework. So it's not an easy question to answer, but the one thing is very clear now: we're an integral part of that in some way or another, and we cannot discount nature in the future. So how far are you going to go? If you're discounting and relying your modes of production, for example, are relying on cheap labor and cheap nature, and you're discounting that, that's a problem. And I think what the opportunity of climate change and COVID-19 is, nature is no longer cheap. Nature is becoming extraordinarily expensive. So we need to revisit this paradox between nature and humans. So I think this is one way. The big opportunity we have now is that nature is no longer cheap. It's cost us $30 trillion or something. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk about the nuance on commercial trade afterwards.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think I agree with Kris, and I think specifically speaking to this latest pandemic, I do believe that we were as a conservation community, that's how I perceived it, at least also speaking to people within even my own family and circles, that it is quite, these linkages are sometimes, we're not trained to do that, to communicate them properly. We tend to focus on our own sort of expertise, and so it's incredibly hard to make all these linkages sound like a positive thing in the middle of a disastrous circumstance with people losing jobs, losing lives. But I think that the conservation community kept a sort of a cautionary approach to the whole pandemic, and whilst it was trying to make the linkages and call the attention for the crises that are underpinning essentially these events that are happening and will continue to happen more frequently, there's been some caution, precisely because I think we still are a bit concerned about hurting some susceptibilities. And so I think part of the communication strategy needs that we become a little bit braver in how we communicate these things. And I don't have the answer necessarily, but I think it's this sort of platforms that are useful to sort of refine what these would be. But I think we need to be braver and in making the linkages and present the narrative not as something that is incompatible with the current circumstances of job losses and economy going down the drain and people dying, but it's actually very ancillary to it, and we need to talk about it. Like Kris said, I mean, we just have to talk about it. They're not separate anymore. They've never been, and now it's even more patent, more evident that we just cannot disaggregate the two.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that. Yeah, I think there has been a fairly significant amount of pretty unhelpful narrative around this, and often on the side of conservation leaders and in some cases agency heads are saying this kind of thing, that well, this was we told you so, and this we predicted this, and it serves everyone right, because we hadn't reacted, and I don't think that's a helpful approach at all to take. And I think we know that from decades of trying to get climate change on the agenda, that the worse you make people feel about this issue, the less the more insulation they put around themselves, and the less likely that they are to engage, and the less likely they are to commit and contribute to the solutions that we all need to contribute to get around this issue. So I think it's we have to resist that kind of urge, as people interested in the environment. We have to resist that urge to be sort of pointing fingers and standing on a high horse, when everybody's suffering this catastrophic loss, and it's a catastrophic loss across pretty much every sector. It's got such far-reaching consequences that everybody's feeling pretty bad about this, and we need to team up and not be destructive about the way that we do that. I think the green recovery narrative has taken the lead in trying to make this a positive, have positive outcomes for the environment in the future, for the sustainable development agenda more broadly. And I'm very encouraging of that approach.
Do you want
me
Kris?
Yeah, Kris.
Sorry. Do you want me to just talk quickly about the commercial wildlife trade and the ban? So that's a very good question from Emma. There's always two sides to it. There's a messaging which is in 140 characters going out on Twitter, and there's a messaging on whatever platforms you have, and then there's a background and policies and things in place. So that's the one aspect of it. The range of approaches is, just to be blunt, we said this is a safe space, so I'm going to use this as a safe space and just be quite blunt. If you do not have a health knowledge and an understanding of basic epidemiology and so on, you may promote something which seems to provide a goal, a very rapid goal, and that could be, we're going to close a limited number of markets, we're going to attack the most high-risk species, and so on. And this is something we're seeing a lot. We're seeing a lot of push for this kind of approach. Now, in the face of thousands and thousands of live animal markets that are selling wildlife and hundreds of species being traded, and I told you 700,000 viruses potentially having zoonotic potential, where are you going to do those 50 or 100 markets you want to close and you want to attack? Which species are you going to address? So this just, as I pointed out, it doesn't make sense to, and from my perspective, from our organization's perspective, to try to address it on a species or pathogen level. We need to look at the mechanisms, the behaviors, the drivers that are driving this trade, that are driving these spillovers at logging roads, and so on and so forth. It's the interfaces and the encroachment on the environment and the mechanisms that are causing these spillover events. And I think Kris Murray also pointed out, we don't know much about the mechanisms. There have been some super simplifications pushed in the last few months. The favorite one is the Lyme disease model, which is great for Lyme disease. It's been pushed out as if this was everywhere. We need to have biodiversity and it all's good. This sort of goes a bit to the nature healing thing. That's not the way it works. It works for Lyme disease, it works for Chagas disease, it works for a few others in very, very specific contexts. The honest answer in other contexts is we don't know. So we may need to do research, but we do know it spills over. So we know where that line is. That we know. So that's where we need to concentrate at the moment. It's not the only thing we need to do, but that's one thing we need to address.
Thank you, Kris. I think we have one more question in the chat from Giulia Lombardi from Barilla Foundation. And let me read it. So from their experience, from your experience, how do you see the role of health community partnering with environmental community to promote ecosystems regeneration? So like the push to transform current agribusiness practices, decrease dangerous impact on agriculture is having on planet and human health. So do you have any examples of that and of this collaboration between the two sectors?
I've just got a personal sort of anecdote, I guess, to start that discussion off. You know, I recently considered and pulled together a project to submit to a health funder exactly on this question. You know, how do you look at the health and the health benefits, the health costs, the environmental benefits, and the environmental costs in agricultural landscapes by doing different things? And the feedback that I got from the health funder is this is not healthy enough, you know, and this is very common when you go to submit a project idea, a big project idea that has the potential to dwarf the type of burden of disease that we're talking about for, say, malaria, something like that. So we've done some work to sort of suggest that the total burden of infectious diseases related to the trade in agricultural products is possibly twice the global burden of malaria. And yet when we go to talk about this issue to a health funder, it's too abstract. It's too, you know, it's too wishy-washy to really attract the interests of hardcore health funders. There are funders that take specific aim at this kind of interdisciplinary stuff, and that's where, you know, a huge number of these interdisciplinary projects that we've been talking about that look at the interconnections between health and the environment are coming from foundations with specific interests to challenge this siloed kind of approach. We know from, for example, in the UK, the research councils there, they're very pro-multidisciplinary in terms of the way that they write funding calls. But the stats are, the more focused you are, the more chance you've got of getting that particular funding. So there's a direct conflict between what we're being told as researchers in terms of the need for multidisciplinarity and the outcome of those calls. So I would sort of say, you know, one of the big challenges is, you know, how do we collectively, you know, push towards a funding landscape that is able and open to consider these non-traditional type approaches for looking at environmental health research.
Thank you, Kris. Kris, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to, and Catarina has already brought this up. I mean, this idea, and if you look at the Berlin principles we brought up, transsectoral funding streams is one of the most important things. It's always talked about. I don't know any that are really transsectoral, and it's not only research oriented, it's also an implementation of projects. It's often very, very narrowly focused, very focused on some deliverables along the line. So one of the things I was going to say, because this foundation's on this call, is one of the areas where foundations could really differentiate themselves in funding to, you know, multilateral funding and so on, would be to provide a space where we can actually start working in transsectoral areas. And, you know, we all write the word multidisciplinary, and I can get on board. We do work multidisciplinary, but we also use the word transdisciplinary. I think we would really need a space where we could all spend some time to actually work on how are we going to actually do this? Because at the moment, it's still 2 and 2 is still 4. I've never managed to do 2 and 2 is 8, which is sort of would be the idea. And we are constantly reacting to the next crisis. I cannot think anymore. I really regret it. I can think at 10 o'clock at night. So I think foundations have a possibility to create space. As Catarina was talking about, the Large Carnivore Initiative is a good one. Some of the cost initiatives in the EU are great as well. Just to sit down and talk and move forward. So that would be my plead at the end here.
Thank you so much, Kris. And I think maybe a question back to our participants who are all from foundations. So from what Kris just said, what do you think, what should be the role of philanthropy? And do you see any kind of potential to create this kind of transdisciplinary platforms around these topics? So a question to you all.
Please feel invited to just unmute as well and just speak out. You don't need to use the chat only.
No answers? I don't see any question, hand raised.
Otherwise, we can use the time. There is another question in the chat. How can the conservation community be more bold and less reserved in its communication of these messages, which are so crucial to preventing further disasters? Other sectors seem to be able to get their messages through to governments much more easily. Are we too timid? So it's again on communication, if the conservation community is too timid in communication, which links again back to our Kris, your contribution that we need maybe platforms where people can speak out and discuss it. So any comment on that? I think it's more a comment than a question.
I think maybe one thing is the kind of the very fine line between, you know, scientific research and being a scientist and the role of advocacy in putting some of these issues on the table. And for a lot of scientists, getting in, you know, on the advocacy side of things is very uncomfortable, and in some cases it could actually even have, you know, ramifications, you know, in terms of, you know, how they're regarded as scientists, their scientific objectivity and all that kind of stuff. And that's something that I think we all grapple with all of the time. In health, maybe, you know, that I think one thing that is really interesting about the kind of recent development of the planetary health space is you've got, you know, suddenly a whole bunch of medical people, doctors, and, you know, people trained in human medicine that are bringing their voice to this very same issue that conservation biologists have been jumping up and down about for literally decades, you know. And so it's easy as an environmental scientist to be a bit cynical about, you know, all these health people suddenly coming on board and saying the same things that you know, that they've been saying for a long time. But, you know, maybe the line is a little bit fuzzier, you know, in terms of the advocacy for human health. You know, and I'm not 100% convinced that we haven't been, you know, as loudmouthed as we need to be, or as you know, bold as we need to be. I think that there's a lot more to it than just you know, just jumping up and down. There has to be a certain societal receptivity. There has to be a certain you know, certain support from, you know, for example, governmental narrative and structures and that kind of thing. And I think with, you know, some of the big protest movements that we're seeing, you know, around the world in recent years, you know, we're getting to a point now where I think these environmental issues are on the table. They're more present in the public eye than perhaps they have been for a very long time. So, you know, I guess our job is, you know, how do we continue that? How do we capitalize on that? And you know, and move things forward.
Okay,
yeah.
maybe trying to answer the question on foundations as well. I think we have already raised one important point, which is creating space for transdisciplinary cooperation. Because what foundations are good at, that they can think about possibilities to bring different actors together. Create room for discussions which would not take place because people are so, which normally would not take place because people are so in their own universes. And this is something foundations can definitely encourage. And I think this is already taking place in different, and there are different examples also on when it comes to linking health with other topics. I personally work on climate change, so we're supporting initiatives where we want to link health and climate change, because there is, of course, also a very important link, which we have not been discussing today. And what we can support there as well is then joint advocacy activities to give those actors a voice to bring this or to make this more visible with the public and with political stakeholders. So there are, of course, different activities in the field, and what we haven't done today is to gather all those initiatives which are already there and which some of the foundations in the call are definitely also supporting. I think that should be or could be a very interesting next step also for the network, to find out what is already happening and where we can maybe also try to think about learning from other initiatives in different countries, also bringing our experiences together. So that was a good start today, and thank you very much for all the contributions we had. I think, Tina, we can move towards the summary, looking at the time.
Exactly.
I would like to give the participants which are remaining in the chat the possibility to look again at the link which we posted earlier, which you can find in the chat. I think Deborah can post it again. And what I will do now, I will share my screen and show you the results, which are interesting as well. Wait a second. So, can you now see my screen? Yeah, you see the results of the poll. Tina, can you give me a sign?
Yes, we can see
Yep.
it. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Okay, so these are your answers. Please feel invited to add new keywords. You were invited to use a link to enter some keywords which you take away from today's presentation and discussion. And I think what we can see here already gives quite some good overview about the main points we were discussing. I think COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated all too painfully that human health, animal health, and environmental health are strongly linked. We have here also the word clear increase. We see that there is a clear increase in emerging zoonotic diseases. This is a result of the development that we see, dramatic reductions in natural ecosystem and biodiversity. We have a lot of words in the cloud which refer to transsectoral, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches. This is, of course, an important answer. If we want to control these diseases, of course, we need more surveillance. This is not, there's nothing in here which is on that, but we also need to address the root causes. There's the word agriculture in there. We spoke a lot about agriculture in several questions, but we also spoke about, let's see, there's share land, spare land, which is also on that linkage. And we spoke a lot about the collaboration and connecting health worlds, about bridging gaps between veterinary medicine, human medicine, and ecology and conservation science. This is crucial, I think. There's a lot of work which still needs to be done. There are important efforts already happening. We have heard that, but there are also, and this is quite clear in this word cloud, I think there are also several communication barriers when it comes to language. I think there's a word language somewhere here as well. Communication at least, yeah. So, yeah, there's some new words coming in. Okay, yeah. I think there's a lot of food for thought. That is clear. There's a clear role for foundations. We'll be discussing that in the end. We need to create spaces for transdisciplinary research and initiatives to happen. And people say that's good. There's food for thought, and it has been informative. So this is thank you for helping us with the summary. I think we can share the word cloud in the end as well, because it gives us some good help for the follow-up. Thank you all for your very valuable contributions today as speakers and of course as participants as well. As I said in the beginning, we will continue the series of webinars over the summer until autumn. We will update you through our mailing list, and you can also find the invitations to the webinars on the EFC website, of course. So thanks a lot and have a nice summer.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.